Have you ever looked at a G-Shock Casio and thought, it's got a great module in it, but I kind of hate everything else about the watch? It's too slim, it's too lightweight, it's too modest. I wish it was just this giant metal beast of a watch. That's not a thought I've ever had, but apparently someone over at SKX Mods did, because they came up with the craziest Casio mod kit that I have ever seen. Hey guys, welcome back. The channel is Just the Watch. My name's Dave, and as always, I'm recording this from my home in Iwate, Japan. Today we're checking out some insane mod kits from SKX Mods. This is basically a kit to take a GA2100 series module and stick it into a completely new case with new hands, new markers, new absolutely everything, that basically turns it into a giant Seiko tuna. And the result is equal parts insane and incredible. They didn't just make this like some fun novelty watch. This thing is a really impressive piece of machinery at the end of everything. SKX Mod sent me a ton of different parts, so I'm actually going to wind up building 2 of these watches. And depending on how far you want to take it, there's a couple of different ways you can do this mod kit. Some of which are fairly easy to do and some are a little bit more in depth. I'll show you each of these as we go, and you kind of see if this is something you're interested in doing. And they did give me these kits for free, which is why you saw the paid promotions flag at the beginning of this video. However, other than the kits and parts, they did not provide any additional compensation, nor did they have any control over the content of this video. We'll start with an overview of what the kit looks like when it's done so that you can see what you're getting into, and then I'll show you how to build them. We have to start with the dimensions on this watch because this thing is enormous. The diameter is about 51 millimeters across. If you measure from top to bottom, it's about 52.5 millimeters. This is a lugless design though, so it does wear a little bit more compactly than you would expect given those massive dimensions. But the one that really is going to stand out is the height. This watch is 16 millimeters tall, so it is a very chunky watch. And the reason it's so thick is because of the extreme level of water resistance that this watch has. Now, they're writing 1,000 meters all over the case. That's what they designed this thing to take. They tested it in a couple of different ways. The more accurate machine testing that they did, they ran it up to 500 meters. And I'm guessing that the reason they stopped at 500 is that you might need some specialized equipment to measure pressures beyond that. So what they apparently did instead was strap it onto a remote operated vehicle and drop it down to the bottom of the Antarctic, where it survived down to a depth of 1,500 meters. Now, some of you are looking at these dimensions and specs and thinking, well, that's crazy and insane. Why would anybody ever need that? Others are going to be looking at this and realizing exactly what this watch is, which is essentially an homage of the Seiko Marine Master 1000, also known as the Emperor Tuna or the hockey puck. This beast of a watch was released by Seiko in 2009 to the JDM market. It's probably the toughest and most technically superior dive watch that Seiko has ever made. And this kit from SKX Mods essentially creates a watch that matches the Marine Master 1000 in terms of dimensions, water resistance, and design. But in order to get the original from Seiko, you'll need to shell out $3,000. Whereas you could build this kit from SKX Mod, including buying an original G-Shock to modify, and spend less than $300 depending on how you spec it out. There are a lot of different options here, so that's going to drastically affect the cost and the amount of money you put into this. They have 3 different case metals available in stainless steel, titanium, and bronze, with bronze being the most expensive. You're also going to have to factor in which Casio you're going to start with. If you go with the basic GA100, that'll keep the cost down. But they also have kits available for other Casio modules, such as the ones that feature Bluetooth and solar power. However, it is important to note that the modules in those watches are a different size from the base GA2100, so you do have to buy a kit that is specific to the module that you're going to use. And for reasons we'll get into in a minute, I would highly recommend going with a solar-powered option. The other consideration when you're picking which metal to use is the weight of the watch. This is a massive watch with a very beefy construction, including that extra layer of that metal shroud. I have a titanium version and the bronze version. Fully built, the titanium version comes in at 154 grams and the bronze at a massive 224 grams. Stainless steel is just a little bit under the bronze, I think, but essentially the same weight. For context, the Seiko Marine Master 1000 that this watch is modeled after was made in titanium, and that one came in at 140 grams, so just a little bit lighter than the titanium version of this mod kit. But even on the titanium, it is still a pretty hefty watch. Another thing that's cool about these kits is that they don't just mimic the style and the dimensions and the specifications of the Marine Master 1000, they also follow a similar construction. So this features a monoblock case. That's a case that doesn't have a case back, it's just one solid piece of metal. So the movement or module is dropped in from the top, and then the crystal is placed over that and then sealed with a locking ring. Also, like the Seiko Tuna, the crystal features an L-shaped gasket, and these features all contribute to the massive water resistance that this watch is capable of. Likewise, you're also getting the most famous feature of the Seiko Tuna, which is that metal shroud that wraps around the bezel. This shroud adds another layer of shock protection, and it also limits your access to the bezel, which prevents it from getting accidentally turned, which was another professional feature that Seiko pioneered. So in terms of functionality and construction, this watch follows Seiko's pattern very closely. Finally, the finishing on the bezel insert, the hands, the markers, and the case are all very impressive. This is a far nicer, more expensive looking build than the original G-Shock that you're going to start with. That combined with the sapphire crystal and the incredibly impressive lume that this watch features, in terms of feel, really brings everything much closer to that $3,000 Seiko Marine Master than you would ever expect. But rather than having a high-end automatic movement from Seiko, you're going to be putting one of Casio's full-feature G-Shock modules in the middle of all this, which means that it's going to retain all of the functionality of whichever Casio you started with. It also means that the completed build is going to have a lot of redundancy built in. It has a standard dive time bezel, but it also has the G-Shock countdown timer and stopwatch built into the digital portion of the module. It's got incredible lume, but it also has the G-Shock's LED backlight still built into it as well. The G-Shock module will also give you world time at a minimum, and if you decide to go with one of the more advanced ones, you can also add in solar power and Bluetooth, which essentially can give it atomic accuracy. So when you put all of this together, you're wound up with a really interesting watch. The thing is huge, it's just got an insane amount of wrist presence, it's got an insane level of water resistance, and it's got a ton of features. When you put all this together, the watch has a lot going for it. It's just that all the things that it does have going for it are kind of niche. It's for people who like really big, heavy watches, or who like really impressive water resistance, or who like lots of features, or for people who want a Seiko Marine Master 1000 but aren't going to shell out that kind of money for one. If some of those things or all of those things describe you, then you're going to love this thing. On the wrist, I definitely prefer the titanium version. Despite the size and the weight, I actually found it pretty manageable and comfortable. The rubber strap that they include on this is very substantial and it secures the watch pretty well to the wrist. It doesn't move around too much. And in terms of overall weight, it's going to be similar to a big dive watch on a bracelet. One thing to note is that the titanium bezel is a little bit sticky, as is often the case with titanium bezels. Switching over to the bronze, I did find the bezel a little bit smoother to use, but it was so heavy that it really did move around a lot on my wrist unless I tightened the strap very tightly. Part of me really loved the over-the-top nature of that bright bronze case, but for me personally, everything was just a little bit much, but I guess that's kind of the point. Now that we've had a chance to evaluate the final product, let's look into how you would actually build one of these. And SKX Mods gives you a ton of different options here. You can mix and match bezels, bezel inserts, case materials, colors to try and recreate different tunas from the past or to make your own design. There are also three main ways you could spec out the dial. What I've been showing you up till this point is the complete conversion where you replace the hands, the markers, and the chapter ring with a more premium option that more closely resembles something from one of Seiko's watches. Overall, this is a more difficult and involved mod than I've seen from previous kits from SKX Mods. In order to do the full conversion, you will need to be able to remove and set the new hands on the Casio module, and the tools to do hand setting and removal are not included with the kit. If you've done watch modding before, you'll very likely be familiar with this and probably already have the tools, but if this is your first time doing it, you'll need to source those somewhere, and this is one of the most difficult parts of the process. Another way that you could build this is to try and preserve more of the dial elements from the Cassiope, retaining the chapter ring and the hands. And surprisingly, it still kind of works within this tuna case. However, in order to remove the markers and the chapter ring from your original Cassiope G-Shock, you do need to pop out the crystal from the G-Shock case, which requires a crystal press to do so, which is also going to add another layer of difficulty. Finally, the easiest way to do this mod without needing any additional tools at all is to just leave the hands alone and keep the original G-Shock hands while replacing the markers and chapter ring with new parts from SKX mods. This way you don't need a crystal press or any additional tools, you're essentially just moving the module over. But even if you do it this way, it's still a more advanced mod kit than previous kits from SKX mods. And I don't think the original Casio handset really matches the SKX mods, markers, and chapter ring. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it this way. Now, because this is a somewhat involved process, I'm not going to be giving a tutorial here. SKX Mods has a video where they show the entire process pretty well laid out. And if you're going to attempt this, I strongly recommend that you watch that as well as read over their documentation and do all of your research ahead of time. But I'll give you an overview of the process as well as highlight some of the challenges that I found in the build so that you can kind of have a heads up as you go through it. The first step is, once again, to make sure that you get the correct kit for whichever G-Shock you're going to be starting with. I went with the GA-B2100, which features Bluetooth and, more importantly, solar power, and I would highly recommend going with a solar-powered module. Because of the monoblock design of this case, in order to do a battery change, you would essentially have to disassemble the entire watch, which almost means redoing the whole mod. So with solar power, you don't have to worry about that. It'll just keep working for essentially forever. Once you have your donor G-Shock and the kit that matches it, go ahead and remove the digital module from your G-Shock and you can pretty much throw everything else away. That is, unless you want to preserve the G-Shock dial, in which case you also need to harvest the chapter ring and markers. But if you're doing the total conversion like me, your next step is going to be to remove the hour, minute, and subdial hands and then replace them with the new, much higher quality hands from SKX mods. This does require some special tools and a very steady hand. It's very similar to the same process you would use for removing hands and placing them on automatic watches. So there's a lot of good tutorials, mod tutorials on YouTube that you can watch to get some tips on how to do this well if you need to. Even still, this is one of the most nerve-wracking parts of the mod, so take it slow and have a lot of patience as you do this. Next, you're going to place the module gently into the case. There is a little notch in the case that lines up with a notch on the module to help you line it up properly. I had kind of assumed that it would sort of fall into place or lock into place, but that wasn't really the case. You also need to use a screwdriver or something to gently push out the little pushers on the inside of the case so that the module can slide in. And before going further, make sure that the pusher buttons will activate the various functions on the module, and that'll tell you whether you've got it seated in properly or not. You will then need to line the hands up to a safe space on the dial. If you look at the completed build, you'll notice that the handset is very large and that it does go over both the markers and the chapter ring, which means that you have to kind of slide them into place. Manually moving the handset is a little bit tricky in itself, so that's something you should probably practice doing on the original G-Shock before you get to this point. But this is also one area where having that Bluetooth connectivity with your smartphone is helpful because you can control all that on your phone, which is a little bit easier than using the pushers. Like the module, the markers and chapter ring also have a little notch on them that lines up with a notch in the case that will tell you when it's lined up properly. For me, I expected that that notch would sort of lock the chapter ring and the markers in place, but that wasn't really what happened. They did kind of slide freely, so you had to be real careful until you got the crystal on. Once you put the crystal on and locked everything in, there was enough pressure to completely immobilize the chapter ring and markers, but it was a little bit frustrating getting everything lined up and keeping it lined up until I was able to lock it all in. But once you get it lined up, go ahead and put in the crystal gasket as well as the crystal and the locking ring. Hand tighten it as much as you can and then use the special tool that SKX Mods includes to tighten it down completely. This will seal everything in tightly and give you that 1,000 meters of water resistance. And make sure you hold on to that locking tool because if you ever need to get inside, say to do a battery change, you're not going to be able to do so without that tool. Next is the bezel assembly. The click spring and the bezel just kind of sit on top of that inner case. However, when you install the shroud that comes on top of it, That's what's going to lock the bezel into place. This is kind of nice because it makes changing the bezel out really easy if you need to. You just have to take the shroud off and then the bezel just comes right off. But the downside is that the bezel is a little bit loose as it kind of rattles back and forth inside that shroud enclosure. The final thing to watch out for is that the titanium version came with hex screws to install that shroud, and I found that they were pretty easy to strip. When I was tightening them, my screwdriver slipped one time and did strip the metal a little bit. I was able to find a different bit in my driver toolbox and get a grip on the stripped screw and remove it so that I could put in a fresh one. And thankfully SKX Mod did include a couple of extra screws, so that was nice. But if you do strip a screw and leave it in there, you're not going to be able to get access inside the case ever again, which would kind of suck. But after all that's done, all that's left to do is install the FCAM rubber strap, and you've built yourself a watch that looks and performs like a $3,000 Seiko, while only putting out a couple $100. And you can give yourself a pat on the back for completing the most insane G-Shock mod imaginable. All right, guys, that's going to wrap up the review for today. Thanks for watching. Drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you think of these kits. I was really skeptical going into this, but after all was said and done, I was having a lot of fun with these watches. I think this is going to appeal to a certain kind of person, but if you're that kind of person, this is an extremely high quality kit, and the end result is fantastic. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys later. Bye.